In 1993, a man sold the motorcycle club he had spent 47 years building for $1. His name was Wino Willie Forkner. It all started at a motorcycle race in California in 1946, where he got drunk, rode his bike through a gate, and got thrown out of his club. But that expulsion forced him to build something new. What he built that night in a Los Angeles bar became the foundation that the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, and the Bandidos would later build their entire identities around. The club was the Boozefighters. This is their rise. In 1945, World War II ended, and the men who had fought it came home to a country that had moved on without them. Suburbs, desk jobs, wives and children who had built lives in their absence. The country that had sent them to war now expected them to hang up the uniform and become the kind of men that peacetime had decided it needed. For most of them, it did not work. Among these men was a bomber crew gunner from the Pacific named William Clyde Forkner Jr., who came back to Los Angeles with nothing that civilian life could fill: a truck driving job, a wife and 3 children, and a bar in South Central Los Angeles called the All-American Bar, where veterans gathered every night to drink cheap wine and cheap whiskey together because it was the only place that felt anything like what the war had given them. Not the violence, the company. Men who had been through the same thing sitting in the same room without having to explain themselves to anyone. Alongside Forkner was a man named John Cameron, born in Oregon in 1915, who had been racing motorcycles since age 15. Rejected for military service due to racing injuries, Cameron ran a freight unloading business in Los Angeles, where he and Forkner had met in 1942 before the war. By 1946, both men were sitting in the same bar with the same frustration. The military had given them brotherhood, and the straight world had taken it away. On one night in early 1946, with the wine running out and the bar still open, they decided to stop waiting for the straight world to give it back and build it themselves. The Expulsion. That started everything before the war. Forkner had been a member of a California motorcycle club called the 13 Rebels. He had rejoined them after coming home. The 13 Rebels had a strong focus on racing and structured club life that suited men who wanted order and predictability. Forkner had never been that man. If he had managed to behave himself at a quarter-mile race in El Cajon, California in 1946, the Boozefighters would never have existed. But behaving himself was not something Forkner was built for, and therefore what happened at that race set off a chain of events that changed the history of American motorcycle culture permanently. Bored and drunk during a race, he had no interest in Forkner drove his motorcycle through a wooden gate onto the track and rode around it until he lost control. The 13 Rebels stripped his membership on the spot. The man who had survived bomber missions over the Pacific had just been expelled from a motorcycle club for crashing through a gate at a local race meeting, and he was not finished. The conversation that followed started in the smoke-filled back seat of Jack Lilly Studebaker in early spring of 1946, where Forkner and a small group of veterans talked about building something new. When the wine ran out, they moved the conversation inside the All-American Bar, where a fellow patron named Walt Porter overheard them and shouted across the room, calling them the Boozefighters. The name stuck immediately because it was honest. These were men who drank and fought and rode and had no interest in pretending otherwise. If that rejection by the 13 Rebels had never happened, Forkner would have kept riding with a club that could not hold him, and the Boozefighters would never have been born. But it did happen, and therefore, a name shouted by a stranger became the foundation of one of the most significant motorcycle clubs in American history. But there was a problem. When the Boozefighters applied for membership with the American Motorcyclist Association, the AMA president declined with a response that left nothing open to interpretation. No goddamn way am I giving a name like that to a charter. The AMA was the governing body of legitimate motorcycle culture in America. Their rejection meant the Boozefighters had no official standing. They existed outside the boundaries of what the AMA considered legitimate motorcycling before they had even been to their first rally. That exclusion planted a seed. When the AMA later declared that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding and the remaining 1% were outlaws, the clubs that came after the Boozefighters took that label and built an entire identity around it, the 1%er patch. The originals and the patch. With the AMA's rejection behind them, the Boozefighters did not need to look far for members. The veterans they had been drinking with at the All-American bar were already there and already ready. Men who had come back from the war with the same need, and who had been sitting in the same bar for the same reason. Vern Autry, Jack Lilly, Jim Cameron, George Manker, Bobby Kelton, Red Dog Dahlgren, Dink Burns, Gil Armas, Johnny Rocchio, Johnny Davis, Fatboy Nelson, Lance Tidwell, C.B. Clausen, 16 men in total, almost all of them veterans who became known as the Originals and who built the club from the ground up without a rule book or a manifesto of any kind. The founding philosophy needed no document. Ride, party, brotherhood. No territory to defend and no criminal enterprise to protect. The only requirement was a love of motorcycles and the kind of loyalty that men who had been to war understood without being told. The club patch reflected the man who built it. Green and white with a bottle and 3 stars. The design was based on the vintage Hennessy cognac bottle label, and shortly before her death, Wino Willie's widow Terry explained the origin directly. Willie liked the looks of those 3 stars so much that he put them across the barrel of the bottle. The patch was not designed to intimidate or to signal criminal affiliation or to mark territory. It was designed to represent what the club actually was. A drinking club with a motorcycle problem. That phrase became the tag that followed the Boozefighters everywhere for the next 8 decades, and it fit them more accurately than anything a publicist could have invented, because it was never meant as marketing. It was just the truth. By 1947, the club had grown to 3 California chapters in Los Angeles, San Pedro, and San Francisco, making the Boozefighters one of the first motorcycle clubs in America to operate a multi-chapter structure. The Originals had built something that was already bigger than the bar where it had started. And that summer, all 3 chapters loaded up and rode to a small California town called Hollister for a rally that was supposed to last a weekend, and instead lasted a generation. Hollister, 1947. The American Motorcyclist Association had organized a gypsy tour rally and races in Hollister, California for the 4th of July weekend, 1947. The town had a population of around 4,000 people, and the AMA expected a crowd it could manage. What arrived was approximately 4,000 motorcyclists, which meant that overnight the number of people in Hollister effectively doubled. Riders slept on sidewalks and in parks and in bars that never closed because there was nowhere else to put them. The small town had no framework for what had shown up at its doors and no plan for managing it. The AMA had rejected the Boozefighters by name 8 months earlier. Now the Boozefighters were riding into an AMA-sanctioned event as outsiders who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove to an organization that had already told them what it thought of them. The Los Angeles Boozefighters chapter did not wait for the weekend to start the party. They began drinking at the All-American bar before they even left for Hollister on the Thursday before the event. By the time they reached Santa Barbara, they were already significantly impaired. In San Luis Obispo, they were too drunk to continue driving and slept in a bus terminal. The following morning, they pushed on to King City, where they bought more alcohol from a liquor store before finally arriving in Hollister in a condition that nobody who had seen them leave Los Angeles would have described as road ready. What followed over the next 2 days was later described by a San Francisco Chronicle article as the worst 40 hours in the history of Hollister. Members of the Boozefighters were reported to be racing in the streets and fighting. Approximately 50 people were arrested over the weekend, most for public intoxication, reckless driving, and disturbing the peace. But the incident that defined Wino Willie's personal experience of the weekend had nothing to do with racing or fighting. It had to do with a jailbreak that he was trying to prevent. A fellow Boozefighter named Red had been arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, and a group of bikers had gathered outside the jail with the intention of breaking him out. Wino Willie went to the jail not to join the jailbreak, but to stop it. He walked up to the crowd and told them to forget the Wild West stuff and that Red needed a rest. The police identified the man doing the talking as the leader and arrested him instead. Later that day, a judge offered to release Wino Willie on one condition, that he agreed to listen to his wife. Wino Willie told the judge he had not listened to her yet and was not going to start and stayed in custody. The Boozefighters had only 15 members at Hollister, 15 men out of approximately 4,000 motorcyclists present that weekend. If the media had reported the event accurately, the Boozefighters would have been a footnote in an AMA rally report. But the media did not report it accurately, and therefore 15 men who came to a California town to race and drink and ride became the face of everything that American society feared and quietly envied about the men on motorcycles. The photograph that lied. On July 21, 1947, Life magazine published its account of the Hollister weekend. The article described the events as the worst 40 hours in the history of Hollister and included a photograph that would become one of the most reproduced images in the history of American popular culture. The photograph showed a large leather-jacketed man sitting on a Harley-Davidson surrounded by a mass of broken beer bottles, guzzling from a bottle with an expression that suggested he owned the town and everything in it. Wino Willie and J.D. Cameron maintained to the end of their lives that the photograph was staged. Not a document of what had happened that weekend, but a construction designed to sell a story that the actual events of Hollister had not quite managed to deliver on their own. The man in the photograph was not a booze fighter, and the bottles around his feet had been arranged by a photographer who understood that a carefully composed image of disorder would travel further than an accurate account of a chaotic but largely peaceful motorcycle rally in a small California town. But staged or not, the image landed with the force of something true. The bad boy biker was blasted into the living rooms of everyday Americans in a single magazine spread, and the paradox it created was immediate and permanent. The same image that terrified one half of the country thrilled the other half. Parents who had never thought about motorcycle clubs now had a face for the thing they were supposed to fear, while young men who had never considered riding saw that photograph and felt something they did not want to resist. If the AMA had accepted the Boozefighters application for membership, the institutional framework for the 1%er identity would never have existed. But the AMA had already said no, and therefore when it issued its statement in the aftermath of Hollister declaring that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens and the remaining 1% were outlaws, the Boozefighters were already standing on the wrong side of that line. Not because of what they had done at Hollister, but because of what the AMA had decided about their name before any of them got there. The 1%er identity that would define outlaw motorcycle culture for the next 8 decades was born from a staged photograph and an institutional statement issued about a club of 15 veterans who had come to a California town to ride and drink and been turned into a symbol by people who had never met them. The Boozefighters did not create that symbol. They were used to create it, and the clubs that would build criminal empires on that symbol in the decades that followed owed their entire identity to a weekend that the Boozefighters themselves always insisted had been blown wildly out of proportion. The Wild One. In 1951, a writer named Frank Rooney published a short story in Harper's Magazine called Cyclists Raid. Rooney had been following the Hollister coverage in the Life magazine spread, and had written a story in which a motorcycle gang rides into a small town and takes it over. The story was fiction, but it was fiction built on the fear that the Hollister photograph had planted in the American imagination. A young film producer named Stanley Kramer read it and saw immediately what it could become on screen. 2 years after the Life magazine spread, Stanley Kramer had his film ready. On December 31, 1953, The Wild One premiered in New York with Marlon Brando as Johnny the brooding leader of a motorcycle gang, and Lee Marvin as his rival Chino, whose character was based directly on Wino Willie Forkner. Brando's Johnny became the first great symbol of alienated post-war American youth, and the film produced the exchange that defined a generation. A local girl asks Johnny what he is rebelling against, and Brando replies, "What do you got?" Wino Willie had been brought in as a consultant during production to teach the cast how to dress and carry themselves on a motorcycle. But as production continued and he saw what the film was becoming, he resigned. He was a decorated combat veteran with a truck driving job and 3 children who had started a motorcycle club because the country he had fought for made no room for men like him. The Wild One took that specific grievance and turned it into a performance. Forkner wanted no part of what it became, but what it became changed everything regardless of what he wanted. The leather jacket and the motorcycle and the posture of indifference toward a society that had already made its verdict became a template for rebellion that required nothing of its adopters except the willingness to wear the look. Membership in the Boozefighters swelled through the 1950s as young men attracted by the outlaw image the film had created showed up wanting to be part of whatever had inspired it. The club the World War II veterans had built for themselves was now drawing in men who wanted to join it because a Hollywood film had made it look dangerous. The irony was not lost on the men who had actually been at Hollister. Through the 1960s, membership thinned again as the original veterans aged out, and the momentum the film had generated slowly dissipated. The Boozefighters contracted back toward their California base, but the template the Wild One had established had already done its work. The clubs that came after Hollister took the image Brando had carried across the screen and made it real in ways that neither Kramer nor Brando nor Wino Willie had imagined or intended. The distinction between the image and the reality that Forkner had spent years trying to explain did not interest them. They were not interested in the explanation. They were interested in the power that the image represented, and they built criminal organizations around it that would span 5 continents and produce some of the most documented violence in the history of organized crime. All of it growing from a costume that a truck driver from Fresno had refused to wear. What the club actually was. By the late 1960s, the Boozefighters had gone quiet. The original World War II veterans were aging out. Membership had thinned. The public attention that Hollister and the Wild One had briefly trained on the club had moved on to other obsessions. The club that had accidentally ignited the entire outlaw motorcycle movement was running on a fraction of what it had been at its peak, and nobody outside the motorcycle world was paying attention anymore. But then history repeated itself. In 1975, the Vietnam War ended, and a new generation of men came home carrying the same wound the World War II veterans had carried in 1945. There was another wave of clubs that started after the Vietnam War, and all those men had some version of what we now call PTSD. The Boozefighters became a refuge for veterans who could not hack the straight world, but also could not embrace the genuine outlaw life of clubs like the Hells Angels that had hardened into criminal organizations during the years the Boozefighters had been quiet. The sweet spot the World War II founders had occupied in 1946 was filled again by a new generation of men with the same need and the same wound. If the club had been built around a criminal enterprise, it would have collapsed when the original members aged out. But it was built around a feeling, and that feeling was available to any man who had come home from any war and found the straight world insufficient. That is what kept the Boozefighters alive when other clubs from the same era dissolved entirely. What the club looked like from the inside was described by a man known as Painless J, the president of a Northern Virginia chapter and a tattoo artist who first encountered the Boozefighters through a veteran biker known as Indian Mike. Their connection started over a tattoo session and turned into an open invitation to ride. Painless J hesitated at first because he did not want to commit to something halfway. But when the invitation came back through a close friend, he took it. Prospecting stretched to nearly a year, not because Painless J was incapable, but because he was working constantly and his efforts went unrecognized until the partner he had been paired with dropped out. Only then did the chapter see what he had been doing the entire time. The club is not looking for men who perform well when someone is watching. It is looking for men who perform well when nobody is. The moment that defined his understanding of what the biker world actually was came at a chapter anniversary party in North Carolina, held in a bar built from a double-wide trailer. Multiple clubs were present that night, including more notorious organizations. As a prospect, he spent the entire night fetching drinks, managing situations, and absorbing hazing without complaint. When it was over, he understood something that no amount of observation from the outside could have told him. You are either built for this or you are not. The Boozefighters also operated differently from the 1%er world when it came to women. The founder himself was a married truck driver with 3 children. Women attended events and rides as part of the club's broader family culture, while the clubs that had taken the Boozefighters' reputation and built criminal empires around it treated women as possessions. The contrast could not have been more direct. A drinking club with a motorcycle problem. The phrase fit them in 1946, and it fits them now. But what it conceals is the thing that kept the club alive across 8 decades and 2 generations of veterans, a staged photograph that lied its way into history. The drinking and the motorcycles were never the point. The brotherhood was always the point. And brotherhood turned out to be something that traveled. Hollywood rides with them. By the time the Boozefighters entered the 21st century, the club had become something that nobody in the All-American Bar in 1946 could have predicted. Chapters spreading beyond California, beyond the American Southwest, and beyond the United States entirely. And somewhere inside that expansion was a man who had played one of the most iconic villains in Hollywood history, and who had decided that the Boozefighters were exactly where he belonged. Robert Patrick is best known as the T-1000 in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, the liquid metal assassin who could not be stopped and could not be reasoned with, and whose performance made Patrick one of the most recognizable faces in the history of science fiction cinema. He had worked consistently in Hollywood for 3 decades and had every option available to him when it came to how he chose to spend his time outside the studio. He chose the Boozefighters. Patrick was the president of Chapter 101 in Santa Clarita, California. He had been riding motorcycles for decades and joined the club because the values it was built on in 1946 were the same values he had been living by on his own. The difference between Patrick and the long list of celebrities who have attached themselves to motorcycle culture for the aesthetic and the photograph and the magazine cover is straightforward. Patrick rode. He wrenched. He showed up to chapter functions not as a guest, but as the president. He wore the patch because he earned it. He took his commitment further by becoming a co-owner of a Harley-Davidson dealership in Santa Clarita. At the grand opening, he described his intention plainly. He wanted to create a community hub for riders, a place that was about the motorcycle and the people who loved it, rather than about the transaction. Patrick also starred in Sons of Anarchy as Les Packer, the president of the San Bernardino chapter of a fictional motorcycle club. A man playing a fictional motorcycle club president on one of the most watched television dramas in America, while simultaneously serving as the actual president of a real motorcycle club chapter in the same state. The line between the fiction and the reality collapsed entirely in his case, and the reality turned out to be more interesting than anything the writers had invented. He was looking for what Wino Willie Forkner had been looking for in the All-American Bar in 1946. A group of people who loved the road and meant what they said to each other. The most feared liquid metal assassin in cinema history found it in a club that describes itself as a drinking club with a motorcycle problem. By the early 1990s, the Boozefighters had grown into something that the founding conversation in Jack Lily Studebaker had never anticipated. Chapters across the United States with a history that Hollywood had mythologized and that 2 generations of veterans had lived inside. But growth produced the same complications in the Boozefighters that it produces in every organization that expands beyond the circle of men who built it. The central disagreement was about identity, what the club was supposed to be and who had the right to decide that. And the man who had the most obvious answer to both questions was watching the thing he had built become something he did not entirely recognize. In 1993, Forkner sold his rights to the founding California chapter for $1 and stepped down as president. The price was deliberate. The club he had started in a bar with a name shouted by strangers had never been about money or property, and the dollar was his way of saying so one final time before stepping aside. The 2 men who took control after him were later accused by Forkner and those loyal to him of turning the Boozefighters into a profit-making organization that had abandoned the founding philosophy. Forkner had handed the club over personally and in good faith, But what followed did not match what he had intended. Then one of the two men died, and the question of what the club was supposed to be became impossible to resolve through ordinary club politics. Forkner attempted to buy the club back in the mid-1990s, but the attempt failed. In 1996, he went public with his frustration in an article in Thunder Press magazine that drew a clear line between two versions of the Boozefighters that had been quietly diverging for years, and made that divergence visible to everyone in the motorcycle world who was paying attention. That same year, a group of former members who remained loyal to Forkner's original vision formed a new club called Wino's Crew with his blessing. Their stated purpose was to carry on the memory and intent of the original Boozefighters chapters. The name alone said everything about where their loyalty sat. But Forkner never saw how that dispute resolved. 4 days after telling a San Francisco Chronicle reporter that he was itching to ride down to Hollister for the 50th anniversary celebration and that he planned to stay until the party was over, William Clyde Forkner Jr. died of a ruptured aortic aneurysm at Santa Rosa Memorial Hospital on June 23, 1997. He was 76 years old. The parade through the streets of Hollister that he had been planning to lead happened without him. He had left his parting words to the biker community in writing before he died. His exact words were these: "As we now go together on this last phase of our journey on Earth, we must remind you the destination was never in question, but the trip getting here we will cherish in our hearts forever. Our memories, our friends and family, well, it does not get any better than that. Ride free, be loved, and God bless." The man who had built a club in a bar because the country he had fought for made no room for him had spent 50 years proving that the room he needed, he could build himself. In 2009, a historical marker was placed in Hollister in his honor near the streets where the 1947 rally had taken place and where the photograph that lied had been staged. But the fracture his death left behind did not close with a historical marker. In 2014, 3 Boozefighters members were shot in a confrontation with Wino's Crew at the Hollister rally. The two clubs that both claimed to represent the true spirit of Wino Willie Forkner were shooting each other at the event, held in honor of the weekend that had made him famous. The man who had told a judge in 1947 that he had never listened to his wife and was not going to start would have had something to say about that. But he was not there to say it. The legacy. In early 2006, a group of French motorcycle enthusiasts who called themselves the Boozefighters Tribute Group made contact with a Northern California chapter. They had been riding together for years under that name because the story of Wino Willie Forkner and the All-American Bar and the Hollister weekend had traveled across the Atlantic and landed in France with the same reverence it carried in California. In May of that year, a California officer visited the French group and the first links of fraternity were established. In October 2006-07, French members made the journey to Texas to visit the Boozefighters at their national gathering. The Americans nicknamed them the Magnificent Seven. During that visit, with the approval of Vern Autry, who had been in Jack Lilly's Studebaker in 1946 and was still present 60 years later, the French group was offered the chance to prospect. On October 28, 2006, the full patches were presented in Texas, and Chapter 74 became the first Boozefighters chapter outside North America. The fact that one of the original founding members was still the authority whose approval mattered when the club crossed the Atlantic 6 decades after its founding is one of the more remarkable details in the entire story. The founding generation was not a myth. It was still in the room. After Chapter 74, the international expansion moved quickly, with chapters opening in Australia, Canada, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Italy, Germany, and Belgium. A club that had started with 16 veterans in a Los Angeles bar now had members on 4 continents who had come to it through the same door every member had come through since 1946. A friend who rode, an invitation to come along, a patch that had to be earned. The 1%er clubs that the Boozefighters image accidentally inspired at Hollister spread internationally through drug markets and territory, and the violence required to protect both. The Boozefighters spread internationally through none of that, because brotherhood does not require a territory to defend. It requires only that the men who claim it mean it. That is what traveled. That is what is still traveling. In January 2025, Chapter 72 donated $5,500 to the Soup Kitchen of Greater Wheeling, West Virginia, marking their 14th consecutive year of contributions. The annual Barstow to Vegas Desert Run still connects chapters across state lines the way it always has. These are not the activities of an outlaw organization. They are the activities of a brotherhood that takes seriously the obligation that brotherhood implies. The Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Bandidos. Every 1%er club that has ever operated anywhere in the world traces its lineage back to a drunk man who could not sit still at a race meeting. They called themselves the original Wild Ones. They were right. They were just not wild in the way that anyone watching ever assumed. OWOF, Original Wild Ones Forever. Wino Willie Forkner built the Boozefighters from a bar conversation and sold it for $1 47 years later. In between, he accidentally created the mythology that the most dangerous motorcycle clubs in the world built criminal empires around. One of those men took that mythology further than anyone in European biker history ever had. Click the next video to find out who.